Today we're going to be talking about the Force, and how I'm pretty sure George Lucas didn't quite understand just what he had on his hands, and how much it meant to people. Or, to be more precise, he perhaps didn't understand why it was so important to people. It's possible that younger generations might not quite understand just how big a cultural splash Star Wars made when the original trilogy was released. That's understandable. There's so much Star Wars stuff out there now that it's pretty watered down. Back with the original release, people would go back to see the movies in the theaters 6, 7, 8 times. We're not just talking sci-fi nerds here, we're talking everybody. Nerds, jocks, and everybody in between were now enjoying this style of movie that previously had pretty much been thought of as the realm reserved for dorks that were picked last for sports. So why did Star Wars, and specifically the Force, make such a big impact? We have to look at two things. First, the culture into which the Force was introduced, and second, the heart of fantasy storytelling. Let's start with that second point. Star Wars is of course a sci-fi movie with the laser guns and the spaceships, but those are just the settings. At its heart, it's a fantasy story. Fantasy is probably the genre for small versus big stories, David versus Goliath stories, nerds versus the jocks, mind over matter, people who have to train and struggle and earn a position of worth in the world versus people who are born with physical attributes that automatically put them ahead. Fantasy is the story of the meek, not just inheriting the world, but earning it. I'm not saying it's the only genre that tells David vs. Goliath stories, but it's a huge part of fantasy storytelling. And you can certainly think of fantasy stories that are exceptions. For example, John Carter gains physical strength by going to Mars, or how about Red Sonja and Conan the Barbarian? But even here, the writers of the best Conan movie understood they had to give him weaknesses. Why? Because while characters are cool because of their strengths, they're interesting because of their weaknesses. It's too long to go into here, I think we'll make it the subject of a separate video, but the writers found a way to make Conan weak, into a David of sorts, switching him from being a jock into something more nerd-like. Think about The Lord of the Rings, which I think it's fair to say is the fantasy story that a lot of people consider the touchstone of fantasy storytelling. It's literally small people carrying a small thing to defy a literal giant. It's the epitome of fantasy storytelling. The epitome of the epitome is this moment on the mountain where Frodo slips and Boromir comes up with the ring. Boromir is a jock. He understands physicality. His dad is a sports dad. This is why Boromir is the one that is shamed by Galadriel's glance. She sees this Goliathness in him. But what makes Boromir one of the good guys for the most part is that he has a little brother. Faramir is a poet. He's a nerd. He's a David. He's despised by his sports dad, but Boromir loves him, and that makes Boromir, if not a nerd, at least it makes him into the football player that would stop the other football players from jamming physically weak kids into lockers. Boromir has love for the Davids, but he doesn't quite understand them. He's not one of them. So when he comes up with the ring, he says the thing that every single David vs. Goliath bad guy has said or thought about heroes.
It is a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing.
This could just as easily be Sauron saying it about hobbits, or a jock who ran his high school now finding out he has to work for the nerd he used to terrorize back in the good old days. By the way, this is why Frodo's refusing to destroy the ring at the climax hurts us, because after all the awfulness the nerds have gone through to earn their victory, in this moment Frodo chooses to side with the physicality, the jockness that the ring gives him. He's turning his back on the meek and hanging out with the cool kids. We've seen this elsewhere as well. How do we know Star Wars falls into this David vs. Goliath style of fantasy storytelling? We see it right from that opening iconic shot. And that Darth Vader, he is a tall drink of water. This is why the Force became so important to people, especially in the time frame when the original movies were released. Being into board games, into video games, into programming, into science, into Dungeons and Dragons, they're all accepted now. They're just part of the cultural landscape. But back in the 1970s and 80s, all of those things could get you beaten up, or at the very least ostracized. The Force was the ultimate expression of mind over matter. It's something that took training and learning and study and dedication. Yoda sums it up when he asks Luke if Luke judges him by his size. Luke, who has toned up physically, is getting a bit too jockish for his own good, and he fails to pull the X-Wing out of the swamp. Yoda, a green hobbit, the last to be picked for pickup basketball games, says, "Excuse me, sir, you dropped this." Yoda, who has trained and studied for far longer than Luke has been alive, is more in touch with this universal power than Luke, who between the two of them is far more Goliath-like. The world loved it! What a gift for the nerds! Science fiction and fantasy stuff was now being accepted, at least in the form of these movies. And one of the biggest components of these movies was this expression of nerddom over jockdom, of mind over matter, the Force. And then the prequels came along and did this.
I need a midichlorian count. Over 20,000.
Oops. The Force, this fantasy thing that was originally accessible to everyone who trained and applied themselves, like studying sciences, was suddenly rendered a mere condition of genetics. In other words, when Lucas inserted
I need a midichlorian count
into the prequels, he took the Force and all it represented out of the hands of the meek and gave it to the already strong. He ripped it from the Davids and gave it to Goliath. It went from being something that was earned to something you were accidentally born with, like the ability to run fast or be tall. There's certainly an argument to be made that he always intended this, that it wasn't a churn that he thought of while writing the prequels. After all, the Skywalker family is mentioned more than once as being strong with the Force. But this could have been left to some mystical, metaphysical connection that just meant the Skywalkers just get it, man. But instead we got,
I need a midichlorian count.
Meaning they're just born with it, that you have to be genetically gifted in order to really participate in its benefits. This was the betrayal again, the David siding with the Goliaths. Except this time, it wasn't part of the story in the sense that it was a beloved character turning their backs on the other meek characters. This time, it was the storyteller himself, George Lucas, turning his back on us. The audience, telling us that the Force wasn't something that could make a meek David strong through dedication and practice. Instead, it was something you'd have to be accidentally born with. Lucas was siding with the empires of the world. And just like that, with that one simple line,
I need a midichlorian count.
the Force stopped being an expression of mind over matter.